Before we get started in building the GypWall Classic partition, let's understand the codes on the gyp frame components. 70S50. 70mm tells us the width of stud. S is the component and stands for stud, and 50 is the gauge of the metal in terms of millimeters, which tells us the stud is 0.5mm in thickness. Channels that go with gyp frame studs will always be 2mm wider to accommodate the stud width, so 72 FEC50 tells us the channel is 72mm wide. FEC stands for folded edge channel, and again 50 is the gauge of the metal in terms of millimeters, which tells us the channel is 0.5mm in thickness. 72 DC60 tells us the channel is 72mm wide. DC stands for deep channel, and again 60 is the gauge of the metal in terms of millimeters, which tells us the channel is 0.6mm in thickness. 72 EDC80 tells us the channel is 72mm wide. EDC stands for extra deep channel, and again 80 is the gauge of the metal in terms of millimeters, which tells us the channel is 0.8mm in thickness. Where partitions are between 4.2 meters and 8 meters in height, gyp frame deep floor and ceiling channels are used at the head and base, commonly known as DC channels. For partition heights over 8 meters in height, extra deep floor and ceiling channel should be used, commonly known as EDC channels. It is important to note that DC and EDC channels have a primary use in forming deflection heads on partitions. For medium weight fixtures or to allow a fixing for services, gyp frame 99 FC50 can be used. The code stands for 99mm wide fixing channel, which is 0.5mm in thickness. GFT1 stands for gyproc fixing T-bar and is used to support board joints on single layer applications. GFS1 stands for gyproc fixing strap and is used to support board joints in double layer applications, and can also be used in deflection head details for a board end fixing. Gyp frame studs are designed to interlock with each other to allow gyp frame studs to be extended. A minimum overlap of 600mm should be maintained when you are extending studs. This overlap will be fixed with either gyproc waferhead screws or a stud interlocking tool. On new concrete or screeded floors, consider installing a damp-proof membrane between the channel and floor to reduce the possibility of any corrosion occurring on the floor channels. Determine the wall position and make allowance for openings. Mark wall positions and doorways. For best practice, or to meet British standard duty ratings on partitions for doorway details, a bootleg detail can be installed as is demonstrated. With this detail, 4 fixings are installed within 150mm on either side of the doorway. For 72mm wide gyp frame floor and ceiling channels, fix them into position at 600mm centres with suitable fixings. For channels wider than 72mm, 2 rows of fixings are required at 300mm staggered centres. On uneven floors or where the design of the building dictates, 38mm deep timber sole plates, the width of the channels, are fixed to the floor first with suitable fixings. At doorways, allowances for a timber subframe should be made. Alternatively, gyp frame stud and channels can provide a fixing for door casings, as will be demonstrated. Gyp frame studs are cut to a neat fit with maximum entry into the head channel. Ensure studs are cut through the solid section of a stud and not through a cutout in the gyp frame studs. Locate the stud against the masonry wall, installing proprietary fixings at 600mm centres, and for wider gyp frame studs, 2 rows of staggered fixings at 300mm centres. Locate further studs into position at 600mm centres. Note the only fixed studs are at wall abutments, external corners, and opening positions in the partition. Gyp frame studs within the main run of wall are not fixed into position. This allows adjustment during boarding of the partition. At doorways, openings and external corners, the studs can be fixed in place with either a crimping tool or wafer-head drywall screws. Gypframe 72mm floor and ceiling track is used to form the head and sill of openings. The channel is cut 150mm wider than the opening at either side. This dimension is cut with tin snips and cloaked over the vertical stud of the doorway and fixed in place with either a crimping tool or gyproc wafer-head drywall screws. Be aware that gyproc drywall screws are designed for fixing gyproc plasterboards onto the partition and are not designed for metal-to-metal fixings due to the size of the bugle head, which sticks out on the surface. This can cause bursting of the gyproc plasterboard when boarding takes place. For heavier gauge studs and channels, gyproc wafer-head jack point screws are used. This type of screw has a drill bit type of tip, which pre-drills before self-tapping into heavier gauge studs. Between the doorway head detail and bootleg detail, cloak the stud with a further piece of gypframe 72mm wide floor and ceiling channel. Apply gyproc sealant to both sides of the frame perimeter to provide optimum acoustic performance. 25mm ice-over-acoustic partition roll can be suspended within the partition, with a short length of GA1 angle fixed through the head track and soffit. For medium weight fixtures or to allow a fixing for services, Gypframe 99 FC50 can be used, or alternatively, Gypframe service support plates can be used in conjunction with 18mm thick plywood. Cut the 99 FC50 to length and simply flatten the flange on either side of the channel to allow a flush surface, fixing with wafer-head drywall screws. Gyproc plasterboard joints are staggered on either side of the partition by 600mm, so when you start boarding with a full board width of gyproc plasterboard, this will be staggered by starting with a 600mm wide gyproc wallboard on the opposite side. Gyproc plasterboards are fixed at 300mm centres, with the appropriate length of gyproc drywall screw. At external angles, reduce fixings to 200mm centres. To determine the length of gyproc drywall screw required, add 10mm onto the thickness of plasterboard and use the next screw size up to determine which drywall screw length to use. Ensure you do not penetrate the board surface with gyproc drywall screws. Ensure you cut into the face side of the plasterboard at openings to prevent plasterboard breaking. Preformed door casings will have fixings guidance information. Where a timber door frame is being fixed, pilot drill 2 holes in 4 positions either side of the door frame. Continue to fix the door frame with suitable fixings, subject to requirements of the door manufacturer. Where 2 layers of gyproc plasterboard are fixed either side of a partition, the base layer does not need to be fixed down the centre stud. Board joints between the base layer and the face layer are staggered for strength, stability and fire protection. Gypframe GFS1 should be used at horizontal board end joints to ensure the board can be fully fixed at 300mm centres to achieve the fire protection requirements of the partition. For single layer boarding, GFT1 fixing T-bar is used. Where gyproc plasterboards have been raised off the floor to prevent the ingress of water during construction, this should be filled with a proprietary gypsum-based compound to maintain the best sound insulation possible from the partition. This filling process should take place after the ingress of water has stopped. There you have it, a GypWall partition built in no time.